When I was a young Christian, I used to read 40 chapters of the Bible a day because I was so zealous to understand more of God's Word. But as I began to do that, I began to see that a lot of the verses I was quoting were really out of context. They really didn't mean what I was using them to mean. And even after I began reading it in context and seeing how it began to fit together, I also realized that often it was taking for granted that the author and the readers shared knowledge of particular situations that I didn't understand. And so I began to desire to understand the background, the things that the writer could take for granted that his audience understood that I didn't understand. This really struck me the first time when one day I was reading Romans straight through, and I got stuck at Romans chapter 1 and verse 7, which said that Paul was addressing the saints in Rome. If that was true, I realized, then I could really better understand the letter by understanding what the saints in Rome would have understood. So the more I could know about Rome, the more I could understand the letter. And that continued with a lot of other things as well. I mean, Mark explains a Jewish custom in Mark chapter 7. Matthew doesn't explain it in Matthew 15 because Matthew's audience already knew it. So I began just studying and studying. For 10 years, I just spent almost full time studying the background of the New Testament. And of course, I've done it for decades since then. But I did it, and at the end of these 10 years, I was thinking, if nobody else has written a book that just puts this at people's fingertips, I need to do this. There's no reason that everybody who's going to preach needs to go out and spend 10 years researching all this. I've already done it. Let me just put it all in the book. So after I finished my PhD, that was one of the first books that I wrote. And it's done really well. It's over 500,000 copies have sold. A lot of pastors are using it around the world. And you understand the importance of this, of getting the cultural background, whenever you talk with somebody from a different culture. For example, my wife and I are from different cultures. My wife is from Congo-Brazzaville in Africa. And when we first got married, I would say, "I love you." And I expected she was going to say, "I love you too," which was the typical response in my culture. Instead, she would say, "Thank you." And I thought, my wife doesn't love me. But actually, it was a cultural difference, and it took us time to figure that out. Once we figured it out, we laughed. We understood better. Well, just some samples of some of the differences from the New Testament era to today. For example, with funerals. When someone says to Jesus, "Let me go first and bury my father," in that culture, either the father wasn't really dead yet, and he was saying, "Wait until my father dies and I can bury him," or he was talking about the secondary burial that would take place a year after the initial burial. Nobody would be out talking with the rabbi immediately after their father died, even to begin with. And you can also think of the widow of Nain's son. When Jesus speaks to the widow of Nain, before he touches the bier and raises her son, he's not doing the customary thing. He's planning right from the start to raise the son because he's approaching from the front. The widow would march in front of the bier or in front of the funeral procession. Everybody else, friends, neighbors, anybody from the town or the village, when they saw a funeral procession, they would gather from behind. Jesus doesn't come from behind because he's planning to interrupt the funeral in a very positive way. When Jesus comes to Mary and Martha after Lazarus has died, Martha goes out to meet him alone. Then later she goes back to the house and tells Mary to go out to meet him. Now, why couldn't they come out together? Well, for 7 days after a funeral, they would sit in the home. It was called sitting Shiva. It's still called sitting Shiva. They would sit in the home, and other people would bring them food and comfort them and so on. Somebody had to be there with all the visitors. Weddings also were different in different cultures. In ancient Greco-Roman world, in Judea and so on, it was the custom to invite everybody you could think of, the whole village. But that made it a little bit more difficult to estimate how much wine you would need. So you can see the social catastrophe that was about to happen in Cana, because if you ran out of wine at your wedding, you'd be a laughingstock. Wedding feasts often went on for 7 days, so it was difficult to predict. And normally the groom would go out to meet with his accompanying party, would go out to meet the bride and her bridesmaids, and they would accompany him on the way to the house where the marriage would take place and be consummated, but the wedding feast would still be going on for 7 days. Now you can see why the bridesmaids, who probably were young teenagers at that point, they were utterly humiliated, the ones that were locked out in Matthew chapter 25. There are other things like a lot of the symbols in Revelation actually were very easy to understand in the first century. Those were symbols that were commonly used. Issues like women wearing head coverings, holy kisses. Now, in some cultures today, we have similar things. There are cultures today where women wear head coverings as a sign of sexual modesty. That's what it was in the New Testament period as well. But the point that I want to make is that it was just so important to be able to get this background into people's hands so they could understand the Bible better. And so I wanted to put it at people's fingertips. I did have one issue right after I finished my PhD. The Lord had provided for me all along. I mean, the day before I was going to call my PhD program and tell them that I couldn't come because I had no money. Well, I had $1. The Lord provided the money. He'd provided all along. But I was finishing my PhD and I had no teaching position and I couldn't understand. And I figured out one night how much I was going to need to live on that year just so my research files wouldn't be out on the street. And I was like, I've been trying to trust the Lord, but it's like, Lord, where am I going to get this money? And the very next day, InterVarsity Press called and said, we would like to publish your book. This was the first English edition of the book. And just to show you how much we want you to do it, we would like to offer you an advance on your contract. The advance was to the dollar what I decided the night before I needed to live on that year. God provided. He's faithful to take care of us. But this was his work, and it's still his work, and I'm so grateful that this is being made available or remade available in Brazil right now.